First of all, it's really a privilege to have the opportunity to be hosted by Multotec. We view Multotec as one of the leading and dynamic companies within the sector that we work with amongst many other companies. And we really engage quite a bit with the company to get an idea of what's happening at the grassroots level and trying to understand what the requirements are from the companies so that we can shape policy in government to be able to make the environment more enabling for you to conduct business. So one of our key thrusts within the Department of Trade and Industry is to push the localization agenda. And hence the title, The Drive Towards Mining Industrialization. If we look at what was happening in the economy pre-94, it was largely driven by the minerals complex. Manufacturing capability was shaped around supplying the complex, and we see a lot of lateral industries that have also developed because of the fact that they were initially plugged into supplying the mining industry. So it's very critical. Pre-94, we were talking about contribution to the GDP in the area of about, I think it was about between 28 and used to go up to and just exceed 30% manufacturing contribution to GDP. Today we're really struggling 2 decades down the line where we're looking at 12% and hovering around there. So hence the need towards trying to drive and push more industrialization, especially out of what has traditionally been our strongest sector and base within the economy. So to just tell you what we're going to do, we're going to give you some introduction to the background of the work that we're doing in the department and the study that we did, which was the first of its kind. We look at the scope of the study, so the methodology we followed, some of the key concepts in understanding how we arrived at the findings within the study, and assumptions that we had to make. The data, how difficult it was to work with the data. And then most importantly, the crux of the matter, some of the industries that came to the surface through this whole exercise that we can look at pushing more industrialization and resources to be able to kickstart more strategic industrialization within the mining sector and the supplies to the mining sector. So in terms of the introduction, just to give you some background, we all convened at the end of 2015, when I say all the key stakeholders in the mining sector, and we convened at the end of 2015. If you can remember, the mining industry was in dire straits. Commodity prices were really bad and low and poor. Everybody was struggling. And the good thing that for government in a time like that is that people who didn't want to speak to us before in a hurry, everybody was running behind their tails, wanting to speak to government to say, how can you help us? How can we start working together? So for the first time we had everybody in a room. We had over 140 stakeholders, from the mining company CEOs, Mineral Council, to labor, to all the 16 different government departments which in some way or another touch the mining sector. We had NGOs that were in there. It was just, it was 140 stakeholders together for 5 weeks. And besides a whole lot of other different programs and work streams, the one that we were concentrating on as a DTI was to advance the manufacturing and mining cluster. So, at the end of those discussions, we'd come to a stage where we asked some hard questions and we got some honest answers. We asked, why are you not buying more from South African suppliers? And the mining companies use the response that we don't know who the mining companies are. We don't know who all the companies are out there. And so we realized, okay, we need to try and bring the mining companies and so closer to the manufacturers of South Africa. And one of the other key elements was we needed to, in order to understand what's going on in the mining sector, for the very first time we convinced 4 of the big players in the industry to share their procurement data with us. Now you can imagine how difficult that is for mining companies. So, I mean, hats off to them. We view it as a serious commitment from some of the mining companies that allowed us to have a look at their procurement data for 2015, 2016. Some of them gave us some older data, and not even the Minerals Council had sight of that data. So you can imagine what a big step that was in terms of bridging the divide, trust between government and the mining companies, and commitment to looking at how we can work together going forward in a time where the industry was really in a bad space. So the focus of the work we did, it was just a pilot study to try and identify some of the key value chains, so it could direct us to what we could do more in the industrialization space. The goal was to look at the mining spend, so that we could create industries that have sustainable and secure capacity. And also very important, and this talks exactly to the strategy similar to what you do at Multotec, you must be able to be competitive enough to export. And then the aim was to understand what the overall maturity of the mining supply chain is in South Africa. Looking at the scope very quickly, it was a pilot study, as I said, and the aim was just to look at some of the data with minimal industry engagement. There wasn't time, there wasn't money, there wasn't resources to do all of that at the time. In short, the most important part was that the pilot study was used to guide our thinking, because this was the first time that we were looking at this kind of data, highly confidential data that the mining companies considered to be part of their competitive advantage, and a number of NDAs had to be signed in this process. In terms of the structure, we used supply chain analytics to analyze the transaction level procurement data, and from that try to understand where the opportunities exist for industrialization, local content development, what could be concentrated in the communities, and then also 1 or 2 really large-scale industrialization opportunities. In terms of the approach, standard consulting approach, we did some engagement with the mining industry. We had to develop a lot of data temples, and I'll show you some of those as we went through. We had to collect procurement and inventory data, process which took many, many hours. Had ourselves and our consultant, and we needed to use a highly specialized consultant to do this. There aren't large pools of this skill set in South Africa to do this kind of work. So it was really an arduous task. From there we had to analyze and then obviously come out with some localization ideas. But what was critical, the research was aimed at answering 3 questions. What is the business case for each mine? Why would they want to be party to this exercise? What is the business case for the manufacturers and the suppliers? Why do they want to be a part of this process? And for government, what is the business case? How can we maintain, create more jobs, and how can we develop supply chains? So some of the key concepts. You need to know what the UNSPSC is. That's the United Nations Standard Products and Services Code. This was developed. It's an open source. It's a multi-sector standard for efficient, accurate classification of products and services that is used in the procurement environment globally. So when I say, there's SIC, there's HS. HS is for trade, SIC for industrialization, UNSPC for terms of simpler understanding, it's standards around procurement and procurement activity. I'm not going to go into great depth, but basically what it says is you got a segment. So the segment, for example, will be your electrical systems and lighting components. You take it one level down, and you'll have a family within that segment. There's 10 families normally in a segment. For example, here in this one, lamps, light bulbs, lamp components. You take it a step further down to the class and to the finest level, to the specific commodity. And it's very similar to your HS codes, where you will start with a 4-digit as a global, 6-digit, cut it down, and then from 8-digit onward, mostly country-specific data on your HS codes. But we needed to have a system to recognize what was going on in terms of identifying products and then looking at those products from one mine company or one shaft to the next. I'm going to try and go through these quite quickly. In terms of the quality of the data, it was really an eye-opener for us, and for the mining companies themselves. First of all, it was not a simple process of going to a mining company, sitting with their supply chain and procurement people, telling them what we need. They insert some queries into their databases, press enter, and out on the other side comes a spreadsheet with all your data. It was far from that. It was I mean, when we spoke to some of the institutional lenders who we've been speaking to, and we explained that to them as a huge institutional lender, they were also quite surprised that they're investing hundreds of millions of rands into these companies, and their supply chains are not up to speed or in line and in sync with FMCG, for example, who can tell you anything at the press of a button immediately. So we couldn't. That data was not readily available. Through transfer of ownership, mergers, acquisitions, you had different systems, legacy systems. It was just a really tough task to get this data down. Secondly, although the decision was taken at an executive level, it was difficult at an operational level to extract the data that we needed from the supply chain function. As you can imagine, this is considered to be competitive, highly confidential information, so for them to part with it required a bit of a mind shift, paradigm change, and eventually we got it. The data required immense cleaning. You'll see there, we had to classify the data. We looked at over 1.3 million transactions from these companies. It was huge. The bottom line is that if you looked at the data from one shaft to another shaft within the same company, let alone from different companies, it was different. So, and you're looking at thousands and thousands of items. So it was extremely difficult. But the message that I'm trying to get across to you is that the master data, supplier master data, was really, really poor and inefficient within these highly sophisticated, multi-million rand organizations, which they themselves at executive level were not aware of the extent of the problem that they're sitting with. So in essence, we cleaned close to 18,000 suppliers as well, of which 11,000 suppliers were active. So you can imagine the extent of the systems that they had there. This is just some of the dashboards and interfaces that we had to construct ourselves, where we took all of that. These were like 60 gigs from one company of data. So we had to take all of that information and package it into a format where we can have some sort of common view of what is going on across all the mining companies, and a level lower down across the shafts in the mining companies, so we could have some sort of sanity in how we're going to interpret the data. A lot of the suppliers, you'll see there, about 99% of the suppliers we found via Google, and what was alarming was that if you want to compete in global markets, the bare minimum is that they need to adopt some global digital marketing standards, which were not existent. We also looked at identifying, when identifying the suppliers, what their standing was, their empowerment credentials, and so on. and we found also that many of the suppliers were duplicated within these databases, showing further inefficiency. But we could see, you know, are they BE compliant, BE verification, trying to get an idea of how many what percentage of the supplier base is currently going to BE providers and at what levels they stand. In terms of classifying their products, you'll see that is also, you know, all these different interfaces that we had to build. What's important was that just the third bullet point there was that some of these descriptions were just simply impossible to try and code. That was one of the very, very big problems that we had with the data. I'm not going to go through these in depth because this is not the meat. What's important is that we found that in classifying the material items, the descriptions, categories, and the critical information, like the OEM supplier part numbers or the different, you know, on the back of most items you'll find an EAN number. They were not maintained in the database, in the materials database, so you couldn't recognize in terms of what was being purchased on the materials and supplier databases with what was actually going out there. So how they did asset management monitoring, for example. Very difficult. They struggled with those kinds of things. So all of these deficiencies make supply chain processes inefficient. I mean, you can't have a efficient supply chain when you can't match and systems can't talk to each other. A large number of the transactions, and this was the most alarming part of the process, was that they were classified as free text entries into their master supplier database. So that means they were not even categorized as a bottle of water with whatever number, EAN number was listed with it. It would just go in as item 1, invoice number 123, 20,000 Rand. So you couldn't even tie it back to what you are buying at any one particular time on a particular order. And that was very worrying because it allows, firstly it allows for anybody on the mine floor or in the mining environment at the coal face to be able to circumvent the system that's there and do whatever they want to and procure from whoever they want to. And procure also at a price which may not necessarily be a cost-effective price and might have a serious premium on. The free text items, I'll tell you a little bit later, was so bad that it actually dominated the procurement activity within these mines. In terms of classifying the items, we even had to come up with specific dictionaries to clear up descriptions so that we could at least get the descriptors from one mining company to kind of recognize the other so that we could then compartmentalize it. And then finally, we had to also develop a system where we could link UNSPC codes with SIC codes so that they can also start talking to each other. So, I mean, you can imagine how mammoth this task was. It was really, really difficult. Maybe I should tell you at this stage what we thought would take 4 months. It took us 18 months because we had to go through this whole process of building new databases, writing code so it could try and match the descriptors and then having a system in place where we could then input new data and it will be able to give us what we require. But very importantly, the last one on the data was it allowed us to then isolate specific areas of families. If you remember from the beginning when I talked about UNSPC, families of products that we could look at for industrialization. And we used, and we mapped this on 2 axes, and the one axis looked at factors describing attractiveness, so it was attractiveness, and there we looked at the criteria of value leverage, the potential for industrialization, the kind of economic impact. We didn't want to do small things. We were looking for the hard impact and the larger items that we could extract value from, market attractiveness, the potential to export. If we're going to invest money, if we're going to invest resources and time, the potential to export, not only supply domestic market, jobs, very important for us as government, skills requirement. And then in terms of describing the ease, well, we didn't want to use the term of risk, so we call it how easy it would be. So we looked at risk, complexity, feasibility, sustainability, and then the probability of success if we had to venture down this route. So now we move on to the important stuff and the juicy stuff, where we see what did the research tell us. Well, first of all, the procurement from local entities accounted for 99.6%. Now, that might be a bit misleading, because a lot of what it did tell us at the end of the day is that a lot of the foreign suppliers and foreign OEMs were operating through domestic registered entities, and that we needed to delve a bit deeper into trying to determine how we're going to separate what exactly in terms of volumes are imported and what is exported, what is manufactured domestically and supplied into the industry. We do have that data, so it was we are able to see who's importing what. And then secondly, 77.6% of the total spend comes from Gauteng. So that shows you also, the government talks about localization and localization activities and different definitions of localization to the mine and localization in South Africa. That gives us an idea of where the activity is taking place, followed by Northwest, 16.4%, and then Free State at 4.1%. So that's quite important in terms of giving us an illustration of where most of the activity is taking place. This is the probably the most important slide on the presentation. So this gives us an idea of what the total industry spend is for gold and platinum, which we looked at in 2015, 2016. What's important to note here is that the services section is dominant, and I think you must actually discount that a bit, because we found that of the services, approximately 30 to 40% of that cost was for energy requirements. So the big bills going to Eskom. And then you'll also see that these numbers were quoted on numbers that we simulated from the few companies that we saw, which probably represent between 50 and 60% of the gold and the platinum industry. So they were extrapolated further to give us an indicative figure. So they're not exact, but when we cross-reference them with what's going on in the sector in general, we were pretty close, and it gives us a number to work on. So you can see gold, we estimated that at 59.1 billion in 2015, up and declining to 57, platinum 32.21, and then 32.3 in 2016. So for the first time, we got a sort of accurate idea of the kind of numbers we're talking. And when we're talking, 89, 90 billion a year, you can start planning some serious industrialization interventions based on those numbers. What was very, very worrying is that, as you see in the below here, in terms of the free tax items, the free tax items stood for 39% of the transactional activity. And that accounted for 72% of the value. So that's just huge. That just gives you an idea of what's going on within the shafts and at the mine on site, where the decentralized procurement is actually taking place. You cannot build industrialization initiatives. You cannot have our manufacturers doing 6-month, 12-month planning ahead when that kind of thing is taking place. When we looked at the spend profiling, what this tells you is that if you look at the first segment over here, so we see that 80% of purchases in terms of the value is going to only 850 suppliers. Again, highly imbalanced. 90% going to 1,600 suppliers. So what's happening with that long tail, you ask, and then when we do a little bit more investigation, you'll find that a lot of those are companies that are supplying maybe, or there's 2 or 3 transactions for the year, but they are guys that will just come in and quickly supply some small item, maybe a pump here that's needed right now or like yesterday, and they're not going to go through the proper channels, procurement channels. So that gives you an idea of how the spend is varied and where it's going. For us, what's important is that we need to only speak to a small number and work with a much smaller number of manufacturers and suppliers, which is a good sign to get the industry where we want it to be. So remember I told you about those 2 axes, the one being the ease factor and the other being the attractiveness factor. We mapped all those families over here according to that criteria, and we looked at the families that obviously exceeded 10 million, and you'll see that the lower risk factor, the lower the risk factor, so in terms of being the ease being more easy, it would be obviously better in terms of where we might have success, and obviously the higher the contribution to industry on the bottom axis, to industry and economy, those would define the sweet spot. So the sweet spot for us is this area up here, and those we've separated it even further, and we said, okay, those are the areas that we are going to look at for the immediate focus. And we're talking immediate focus, those are the low-hanging fruits, and those are the ones that we are going to look at in the next 6 months. If we look at the short-term focus in the next 12 months, and then medium-term focus the next 18 months. So it gives us a good idea of where we need to concentrate our efforts. And if we unpack that top right quadrant, again, these are the winners that come out of that top right quadrant. So as you can see, mining and quarrying machinery and equipment, we estimate that spend about 6.2 billion rand. Material handling machinery and equipment, 4.6. Underground mining structures, 3.6. Railway tramway machinery, 2.3. Remember, this is only for gold and platinum. We're not looking at all the other commodities. If you're going to add all the other commodities in, you could probably double these numbers from what we estimate, or very close to doubling these numbers from what we estimate. Pipes and pipe fittings, very interesting. Personal safety. So this gives you an idea of the areas that we are going to focus. And as you can see, it's based on the size and the areas that we have already got domestic capability. In terms of the short-term focus, the key areas: explosive materials, 2.5, manufacturing support services, 3.5 billion, compounds. These are all the numbers above 1 billion. Anything above 1 billion is the kind of areas that we want to look at and unpack to see where we can drive industrialization. Pumps and compressors, heavy construction machinery, electrical equipment, transportation components. We have players in all of these sectors of our economy. And then obviously the medium-term focus that we look at, and here the key areas: concrete, cement, plaster, fuels, rope and chain. As you can see, the key things in these areas are, they're low tech, and there are areas that we're going to focus a little bit more into the future. If we unpack that first one, mining and quarrying machinery and equipment, we take it down even further if we look at what the UNSBC classes are. So the big items, if you take it to the lower level: mining vehicles, crushers and grinders, rock drills, screens and feeding equipment. And then we also know who the major suppliers are into these areas within the mines. So we've got a good idea of who the players are and who we're going to be working with as we're going forward. But as you can see, the dominant players are still foreign OEMs in the sector. I'm not going to go into great detail for the material handling. Underground mining structures, it's the same thing. There's the number of suppliers. It goes out to 1,007. It's a high volume, low value area. And then looking at railway and tramway machinery, the suppliers get even smaller, and these are areas that we're going to look at in the long term. And we are doing quite a bit of work in the steel and fabrication industries, which we are resuscitating at the moment within government. Processing machinery and equipment. And the list goes on until we get to pipe fitting. This sector will be quite important for us because it could have a significant impact on the cost of mining if we can really nurture a domestic local capability in this. We got suppliers. The question is to get them upgraded and making them more competitive. And then one area we're going to look at is personal safety and protection, because we've got a lot of work taking place in this area, and we've even got sector-specific incentives to assist in developing this area. So in terms of the conclusion, we see that in terms of the suppliers and the supply chain, we have a very large tail of small suppliers, and we need to do something about that. That's inefficient. From our initial look at the data, there are opportunities for local community development that presents itself. A large spend is on complex technology commodities, and that is where we want to look at playing in, because that's where the real value add is. The big problem is that there are a large amount of suppliers that are doing just that. So hence, what we've put here in the footnote, the difference between margin adding and value adding, that has become a serious issue for us to tackle. And as you'll see, and if you're following what's happening in the Mining Charter 3, we want to fix that. We want to ensure that through more local content requirements, we're going to have more value adding and try and limit the margin adding component. Don't get me wrong, there's a place for margin adding. Especially when you're talking about supplying into remote regions as goods and services, but we need to concentrate our weight on the value-adding sector of the market. And then finally, in terms of the state of the supply chain and what we learned through this whole exercise is that generally the mining supply chain's maturity is really low. And we've really got to do something about it if we want to have a world-class, globally competitive manufacturing supporting sector that is in line with the Canadians, that's in line with the Australians and our competing nations. It's important that to note that an immature mining supply chain will always impede global competitiveness of the suppliers. You'll never be globally competitive if you can't see in. I mean, it's sad that in 2018, we are doing, procurement is taking place via emails. And you can't see into what's going on the requirements of the mine side, and the mine can't see into what's going on in your activities and your production and your scheduling and what you can get from your suppliers. That's just not how it's done in globally competitive first world mining and supply chains and supply chains across the automotive sector, which is a perfect example of where we need to be. The level of effort to clean and code data, I mean, it was really difficult, and it's going to take years. And part of our pitch to the mining companies and the executives is, let us help you so that we can fix those databases of yours. We can bring in the experts, modify it, panel beat it, so that we can have some sort of standardization across all the mining companies, and we know who we're talking to, and we can view and compare from one company to the other. And just to note, this was just a quick exercise. It was initially, like I said, meant to be 4 months. It took us 18 months. The good thing is, at least now we know what we didn't know before, and we know what the state of play is. We are starting, actually, we're kicking off with phase 2, with our first steercom meeting on the 25th of this month. Where we'll be looking at phase 2, and some of the key elements is those 6 areas that you looked at for immediate focus. Is we're going to have collaborative groups and supplier groups where we're going to get our domestic suppliers, manufacturers around the table who are playing in that space, with the procurement function and the mining companies, their technology development departments, to start talking to each other and understand why are they not buying more South African and local product. What are the problems? Let us see jointly how we can address these problems, and then we can identify specific industrialization needs going forward. So we've got a new phase going that will be kicking off, and that will take us and keep us busy for the next 12 months. Thank you very much.